children still at school, restaurants and bars open, public gatherings are up to 50 people. Must sound like the UK of a few weeks ago, but it's actually everyday life right now in Sweden. The country stands alone from many others in Europe and has shunned the lockdown approach to control the spread of coronavirus. There have been more than 4,000 cases and more than 150 deaths in Sweden so far. The question will be, have they been too conservative in their response to the virus? Freddie Sayers is the executive editor of UnHerd and is describing this as the Swedish experiment. So, Freddie, what is the reality in Sweden at the minute?
Hi, Rick.
Hi.
Basically, the restaurants are open, but they won't actually serve you at the bar. You have to get table service. Schools are open, but not for older children, so 16 and above, and universities are shut. Ski resorts are open. You're allowed to do gatherings of up to 50 people. There's a much reduced number of people on the streets. We know that, but it's still open for business and people are socializing. And, it feels, I've spent a lot of time talking to friends and family over there. I'm half Swedish myself, and it definitely feels like a bit of a different universe from the UK at this point.
And so is it quite a softly approach from the Swedish government then? They're kind of saying, well, it'd be good if you could work from home, be good if you look into social distancing and so on.
That's right. So that people are advised to work from home if they can. They're advised to limit their visits to elderly relatives. And there is some pressure now as we're about to come into Easter, where a lot of Swedes go up to the north and go on skiing trips and stuff. So there's a little bit of pressure to not do that. But I just checked a website earlier this evening looking at how open they were. And something like 90+% of the ski lifts in Sweden are open. So clearly The country is open for business. And I don't think it's right that people are carrying on as normal. The people I've spoken to are worried. It's being discussed. It's a serious atmosphere, but people are continuing to go about their business, and there's been no legal lockdown, and that's the real crucial difference. At this point, it's the only country in Europe that hasn't imposed some kind of legal lockdown. So, there's a lot of eyes on Sweden. A lot of people are interested to see what they do next.
So who's leading the Swedish response? Who's forming the Swedish plan?
They've got their own, we've now got used to Chris Whitty and Patrick Vallance, our own kind of medical and scientific experts. They've got their own guy called Anders Tegnell, and he's suddenly gone from obscurity to being a kind of national leader. He's on the TV every night. And the Swedes, even more than us, have a real tradition of respecting the independence of their kind of public agencies. So it's a much less political conversation than it perhaps would be here. As far as many Swedes are concerned, it's called the state epidemiologist. He's the guy in charge. And as long as he recommends the course of action, most people are behind it. So it's a sort of technocratic rather than political conversation.
And so is his forecasting different then, or is he just saying different measures are required?
His forecasts are different, so he's published quite detailed forecasts, region by region, of what they expect to happen. And he actually takes quite public issue with the Imperial College study that is thought to have influenced our own government in kind of speeding up the lockdown process. He says it hasn't been peer reviewed. He thinks the assumptions behind it are overly pessimistic. And his own calculations are less so, basically. So when he runs the numbers, they've expanded hospital capacity. They are, encouraging gently this social distancing. But he thinks along the current trajectory, Sweden should be able to manage it without their hospitals being overrun.
Has there been much criticism within Sweden of this approach? I mean, you say that broadly people are on side with it, but some people must be voicing concerns, sort of looking around the rest of Europe and thinking, why aren't we doing what everyone else is?
Definitely. There have been groups of scientists and medics who've written into newspapers. He's received, for a sort of public official of that kind, he's received an unusual amount of criticism in Sweden. But it doesn't have the same heated atmosphere. You know, when I talk to friends and family and journalists over there, it does feel a bit like another world, because we've had over here, after 3 painful years of the Brexit argument, you know, we are so divided and so mutually suspicious. You know, when the Boris Johnson government first came out with what appeared to be a more moderate approach, you know, it was very, very quickly hotly disputed, and it became a political argument. Whilst Sweden is more, I guess they're possibly more conformist as a society, but it's also it's a less divided society, and they for now, you know, they support what he's doing.
So the state epidemiologist, whose name I don't think I'm going to be able to pronounce correctly, so I'll leave it alone. Tegnell, okay. Is he anticipating that there will be a full lockdown at any point, or is that kind of off the table?
He's saying he keeps the options open. So, you know, a lot of people think that might happen. And certainly, you know, the pressure will increase, because already, you know, they're now at 180 deaths and around 4,500 certified infections. You know, they're kind of reaching the point in the curve where that number will be increasing quite a lot on a day-to-day basis. So I think certainly there will be pressure for that. But he so far is really resisting that. And he says, look, we are, like all other countries, we're going to have a time of it, and there will be, sadly, a number of people who die. But he doesn't feel like the cost-benefit justifies forcing people to stay at home or closing schools.
Are there any kind of demographic differences between Sweden and neighbouring European countries and the UK that mean a different approach might be appropriate?
Well, one thing that he has pointed out is that the number of multi-generational households is very, very low. So one of the reasons why people think it might have spread so quickly in Italy is that there's a lot of households with grandparents and young children and everyone living together, while Sweden is a more individualistic, I suppose, society, and there are lots of single people, lots of couples and small sort of nuclear families. Mm-hmm. So he feels that will spread will slow the spread of the infection.
Because less transmission within family groups in the home.
Less young people sort of mixing with the old. I mean, the controversial bit basically is, you know, you remember that phrase herd immunity that was talked about a few weeks ago and became a real kind of a highly controversial idea. And at the point, people were, you know, it sounded like the government was kind of going to allow people to die as part of some sort of experiment. He won't use that phrase, but actually,
it's kind of
kind of similar to that,
isn't it? Yeah.
Well, what he says is that those countries like South Korea that have successfully managed to fully suppress the pandemic. He says, well, what happens when they lift those restrictions? So he doesn't actually even think that full suppression would be a desirable outcome. He thinks that the disease needs to pass through the population, and the main thing he's keeping his eye on is that the hospital system isn't overwhelmed.
And so he's firmly of the belief that actually in these countries where it appears the epidemic is being controlled, once those restrictions are lifted, there will be another surge, and that just kind of keeps repeating.
That's right. So, you know, in a Swedish context, the people they naturally compare themselves to are their Scandinavian neighbours. So both Denmark and Norway have done the full lockdown, you know, really quite thoroughly. And so there's this unusual kind of distinction between the Scandinavian countries. And right now there are sort of charts that you can already see that show that within Denmark and Norway, the level of infections is slowing, whilst in Sweden it still appears to be rising. And you'd think that at that point, you know, they might begin to panic or begin to change strategy. But his response, and the Swedish response, is that, you know, what are they going to do afterwards? You know, what's the long-term plan here? You know, and he says you can't keep people kept in their homes for months and months or years on end. So the way, in that kind of implacable, slightly philosophical Swedish way, he is urging that they just, you know, keep a close eye on it and gradually allow it to pass through the population.
As someone who knows Sweden well and knows Swedish people, how long do you feel they'll be able to, if you like, hold their nerve?
It all depends on what happens in the coming weeks, of course. And just like here, there's the daily announcement of how many new infections and how many people have died. And I think realistically, if that really sort of escalates, and particularly if hospitals begin to be overrun, that's where things get really dangerous, because people then start dying of other things that they can't receive treatment for. I think there will have to be a change of course. But for now, the signs as they are quite committed to it. And in a way which would be unrecognizable here, where we're quite used to being worried if our government is doing something different to, neighbours in Europe. There's an element of kind of Swedish exceptionalism. They're not unhappy with the idea that they have a different strategy to their neighbours. So I think they will stick to it for as long as they can,
because they feel quite proud of the fact that they're sticking to their guns and doing their own thing. Thanks very much, Freddie. That was Freddie Sayers. Very interesting perspective on how Sweden are dealing with this pandemic. Very different approach. Freddie's the executive editor of UnHerd.